here we go. The other thing that kind of triggered this as a timely topic was there's a bill currently being considered in the Arkansas State Legislature. Last I looked, it had been passed by the House and was being reviewed in the Senate Committee on Education. This was introduced about 6 weeks ago on March 11th, 2021 by Representative Mary Bentley from Perryville that would give, although not mandate, teachers at the K through 12 level in science classes in Arkansas public schools or public charter schools, give them the option of teaching creationism as a theory of how the earth came to exist. Now, this has actually been proposed before. Back about 20 years ago, there was a law that tried to get through the Arkansas legislature that would have not mandated the teaching of creationism, but prohibited a lot of evolutionary topics. We actually had to meet with one of the representatives to voice our strong suggestions for why this was a bad idea, and the bill died in committee. But every so often in this state, this is the kind of thing we have to deal with. And I do not know your personal backgrounds or faith journeys or...
Hello.
Yes, are you there? Lauren, are you there? I'm not muted, am I?
Sorry, I can hear you now. I was having a problem.
Okay, all right. Where was I? Right. I don't know your personal backgrounds. I don't particularly want to know them. It's not my business, and I'm certainly am not here to attempt to damage anybody's personal faith or personal convictions or anything like that. That is not what the state pays me to do. But I do want to take a look at the background of this thing we call creationism that periodically pops up, especially if, like myself, you teach evolution in the Buckle on the Bible Belt. And I always like to look at the history of things first. So if we go back to the very earliest Christian churches, and by the way, this is relevant and this could potentially show up on the finals. So this is as important as anything else we've talked about. In the earliest churches, there wasn't a fixed Bible. You know, if your church would be, just a group of people meeting in somebody's house in Corinth or Ephesus or what have you, and if somebody like Paul sends you a letter, you read it and you write it down and you consult it in the future. If you get a copy of what purports to be an account of Jesus's life or miracles or sayings or whatever it might be, you make a copy of it. And it ended up with different groups having their own lists of sacred texts. This is one of them, by the way. It is now kept in the British Museum. It's called the Egerton Papyrus, and it is a fragmentary copy of a gospel in Greek that has some things in common with Luke, some in common with John, and one story of a miracle that doesn't seem to have been recorded in any other text that we know of. There's a whole bunch of gospels out there, and the fixed list of which ones were going to be held as sacred and which ones weren't didn't get set until about the year 360. Even then, it wasn't fully settled. There are some very old Christian churches. The one I have in mind is the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. They've been around ever since, well, according to their story, they've been around since the time of the apostles, and they continue to use books that you're not likely to have heard of, like the Letters of Clement, or a moral guidebook called The Shepherd of Hermas, which they've retained while other churches have not. So there's still not 100% unanimity as to what belongs in the Bible. That actually varies if you look at the total spectrum of world Christianities. And you have to keep in mind that until the invention of printing in the West, um, probably around 1465, if memory serves, every book has to be copied by hand. A book can only exist if somebody is willing to sit down and write it. Here's a medieval scribe plying his trade, copying down a manuscript, and books, like anything, will wear out. So they don't only have to be copied, they have to be recopied. Um, and if you have books that are being hand copied and copied through several generations, well, it's just like mutation in DNA. It's inevitable that copying errors are going to creep in. Um, there are cases where people have deliberately tried altering the text, even the Bible text, for various reasons. Even if we leave that out, there's always copying mistakes. The scribe gets a little bit sleepy, and it turns out that he skipped a line, or miswrote a letter or something like that. And of course, if that copy is used as the basis for future copies, and that one for future copies, every generation is going to build up more errors. There's said to be 25,000 or so ancient manuscripts of either all or major parts of the New Testament. No two of them are exactly alike. And that's just what happens when you're in a world where every book has to be copied out by hand. That's just the way it goes. Kind of like that telegraph game you might have played, only with writing rather than speech. Most of the time you can tell if there's been an error. If you were to, send me an email talking about subject of lecture, I could pretty much tell without you having to correct me that you meant the. Typing TEH for the is a very common mistake. And there's other types of common mistakes in handwriting that can usually be corrected. I don't know if you saw this, but the guy who broke into Nancy Pelosi's office on January 6th, the guy who's actually from somewhere up in Northeast Arkansas, his lawyer argued that he didn't deserve to be held before trial because he had written not bitch on Nancy Pelosi's dry erase board, but biatd, BIAT, and then it looked like a D, but the lawyer argued it was a mistake for a CH, so he'd written biatch instead of bitch, and therefore deserved milder consideration from the justice system. I'm not even making that up. And that's an example of an easy copying error to make. So beginning in the 1600s, first looking at the rediscovered works of the ancient Greeks and Romans, which also existed in a lot of copies that did not all read the same way, an approach to reading those texts called historical criticism came into use. Criticism in this case does not mean criticizing in the sense of pointing out flaws. It doesn't mean that the texts are necessarily bad. What it means is that you use critical thinking in studying things like spelling, grammar, word usage, style, and themes of ancient texts. So-called lower criticism, you take a bunch of copies of the same text, whether it's the Bible or Plato's Republic or Julius Caesar's history of the wars in Gaul, whatever it is. You take a bunch of variant texts and you try to reconstruct what the original text must have been. And it works an awful lot like cladistics, except what the liberal arts folks call their diagrams is a stemma instead of a cladogram, but the reasoning is very much the same. If you have a bunch of texts and they've all got differences, you can try to work out what the common ancestor of all those texts was. Higher criticism, you're not just trying to reconstruct the original text, you're trying to reconstruct the textual history. Who wrote this? When did they write it? If it's a history, could they have been eyewitnesses, or is that not possible? Why did they write it? Who might have edited it? How did these manuscripts come to be altered? If you have two manuscripts and one shows extra material, did somebody add it to the original, or did somebody delete it from the original? And what motives would they have for doing such a thing? And when this is applied to the texts of, the Greeks and Romans, it's not particularly controversial. People continue to do this all the time. But things started heating up in the 1700s when scholars like Friedrich Daniel Ernst Schleiermacher began turning higher criticism techniques on the Bible itself. And again, criticism in this case does not mean finding flaws. Many scholars who've done this were quite devout, and they certainly weren't trying to debunk the Bible or to argue that it's false or useless. What they wanted to do was just get a clearer picture of how we got it in the form that we have it, what the original writers might have been thinking, who they were, why they shaped the text in the way that they did. So higher criticism starts kicking in. Just to give you a little taste of this, and by the way, never mention this to a Central Baptist College theology student because you'll get your ear talked off. Don't ask me how I know. The first 5 books of the Old Testament, that's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers. Or is it Numbers and then Deuteronomy? Anyway, the first 5 books, if you read them, you find that the style tends to change, word choices tend to change, and a number of stories actually appear twice. Sometimes separate and sometimes kind of cut and pasted together. And the reason it's now generally accepted, except at CBC, is that there's actually 4 different books by 4 different writers. We now abbreviate these. We don't know who the writers were. They didn't sign their names, but we now abbreviate them J for the Yahwist, because he usually uses the word Yahweh as the name for God. E, the Elohist, because he usually uses the word Elohim as a title for God. And then P, the priestly writer, because he uses a lot of what he writes are the kinds of things that would directly concern priests in the Hebrew religion. There's a lot of concern with timekeeping and with the details of sacrifice. And then finally, D, the guy who wrote Deuteronomy, is very different from all of these, and he's just called D, the Deuteronomist. And then a later editor, a 5th guy, wove these 4 separate accounts together to create what we now call the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And again, that's based on the fact that the first 5 books have double versions or occasionally triple versions of stories. Each one has different word choices and language styles. And this is the kind of thing I'm quite familiar with because I've had to grade a lot of term papers in my life. And if I get a paper that reads, let's say, the evolution of animals is real cool and interesting to try and study And we reconstruct this process using a rigorous approach known as cladistic methodology, which places phylogenetic systematics at the center of biological analysis. Okay, I have read papers like that, and I think you can tell if you got a paper like that, you would immediately know there were two different writers, right? One of them writing in a very different style from the other. Well, you can apply this to ancient texts, and this has been applied to the Bible as well. So, for example, Genesis 1:1 through chapter 2, verse 4a, God is called Elohim in Hebrew, and creation takes place in 6 days. And there was evening and morning, a first day. Um, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and so on. If you look carefully, from the second half of Genesis 2:4 onward, the creation story is told again. It's now not being done by Elohim, it's done by Yahweh. That's God's personal name. That's what's on his driver's license, basically. It takes place over an unspecified length of time. The order of events is different. In the account Genesis 2:4b onward, God plants a garden, creates Adam, then creates the animals, and Adam names them. And then Adam's still lonely, so God takes one of his ribs and makes Eve. In the Genesis 1 account, God makes the plants and the animals first, and then makes humanity, male and female, together at the end of the story. So very different order of events, different concepts of the creator. The Genesis 1, God doesn't really get his hands dirty. He just says things. The Genesis 2 God is the one that actually gets down in the dirt and shapes Adam's body and so on. Different ways of thinking about what God does. And the style of language is different. Although in this case, it's hard to tell if you're reading it in translation. So what we now think is that the creation account in the Bible, just like all of the first 5 books, is actually 4 separate accounts that have been woven together. And that's why you get these shifts in style and these repeats. This is why the account of the biblical flood is actually kind of hard to follow, because some verses say it lasted 40 days and nights, and other verses say it lasted a year. And the reason is 2 different accounts have actually been kind of cut up and shuffled together. This is why some verses say that there's 2 of every animal, and others say that there are 7 pairs of every animal that's ritually fit for sacrifice. Different concerns. Anyway, why should that matter? Let's zoom in on America just after the Civil War. Well, we're dealing with the aftermath of the Civil War. Industrialization is cranking up, especially in the cities of the North. Those cities are growing huge. Unfortunately, what they're leading to is enormous amounts of poverty. Workers have very few rights at this time. So this is when kids are working 14 hours a day for very short wages. All of the modern problems that you think you just discovered, we certainly had in the 1860s in those big cities. There was drug abuse. There was opium. There was alcoholism. There was prostitution. There were gay bars and things like that. It was, desperate poverty in many places. Immigration's kicking into gear, because this is when we're getting these waves of Irish and Italian and Jewish and Syrian and Eastern European immigrants streaming through Ellis Island, the main port of entry for immigrants. Over in the West, you're getting a lot of immigration of Chinese and Japanese. It's also the time when science is starting to rise as a profession. In 1876, the first university in the US was founded that gave PhD degrees and whose curriculum was founded from the get-go on independent research, science, and modern languages, and graduate students doing research in a professor's lab. It's the university as you know it today. It puts science front and center, and the first university like that was only founded in 1876. If you're curious, it was Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. That puts strain on the churches. What should they be doing about this? Should they be working to alleviate poverty? Should they be preaching against alcoholism and prostitution? How should they be responding towards all those immigrants, many of whom don't speak English and are Catholic? We've already talked in a much earlier lecture about how this is part of the paranoia at the root of the eugenics movement. But it split the churches in disputes in three major areas. One is how to study the Bible. Do we go with higher criticism and acknowledge that the biblical text, has been written for different purposes and may have been manipulated for various reasons? Or do we go with inerrancy, which basically says that the Bible can't genuinely be wrong? There's a dispute over philosophy, and I'll talk about Baconian induction versus deduction in just a bit. And there's also a dispute over how you ought to read the book of Revelation, the last book in the Bible, and what it means for your view of history. This is a dispute between what's called premillennialism and postmillennialism. Although I think the postmillennialism might be more accurate to call it amillennialism, but let's not worry about that. As a result of this is when some new denominations form, and there's a split between theological conservatives and liberals. So we've talked about higher criticism. Premillennialism is an interpretation of the book of Revelation that reads that Jesus will literally return soon. We will get the second coming. We are living in the last days. And once he's back, he will kick Satan's butt and rule for 1,000 years. But before Jesus can come back, things have to get worse and worse. And at some point, the truly righteous people will get vacuumed off the earth, an event called the rapture. And once the rapture hits, we have 7 really sucky years coming ahead when the Antichrist takes over, called the tribulation. It's been a while, and you may not be familiar with these, but about 20 years ago, there was a book series called Left Behind that was basically a dramatization of the book of Revelation if these events had been happening in modern times. And it was, made into a movie with starring Nicolas Cage. Poor Nicolas Cage. But I digress. I don't know if all of you were familiar with this, but I remember students really were about 20 years ago. And what Left Behind presents is premillennialist theology, which basically means everything is going to get worse before Jesus finally comes back and fixes everything, well, except for the sinners. But until then, trying to change the world for the better is kind of like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. All you can do is just try to save as many people as you can. So what we now call the fundamentalist movement in Christianity is premillennialist, and it's inerrantist, which says the Bible cannot be wrong about anything. If it looks like it's wrong, it's your fault for not understanding it correctly. That pretty well defines Christian fundamentalism as we know it now. And it started around the end of the 19th century. There's also a very Baconian streak in early fundamentalism. And the Bacon in this case was Francis Bacon, a 16th, not 1th, that's a mistake, a 16th, 17th English scholar and author, Francis Bacon, who was one of the first to try to write about the philosophy of how you should do this thing called science. And what he recommended was a logical practice called induction. In induction, you gather a whole bunch of facts. And once you've got all of your facts, you try to arrange them in such a way that you can generalize them into overarching laws. If you, I don't know, what would be a good example? If you drink a bottle of whiskey and then throw up, and then you drink a bottle of whiskey and throw up, and you drink a bottle of whiskey and throw up, once you've got enough examples of this, you might generalize that there is something in whiskey that causes you to throw up. You're going from the particular to the general. And people who were Baconian thought that the best way to do science was to gather your facts without any preconceived ideas. Just gather everything that you could about whatever you wanted to explain, and then look for patterns in all of those facts. What you probably learned as the scientific method is called the hypothetico-deductive method, where you devise a hypothesis first, then you go looking for facts, but you choose those facts that you're going to look for in such a way that they will provide a test of the hypothesis. To a Baconian, you're not really supposed to make hypotheses, or if you do, you don't talk about it in public and you wash your hands once you're finished. Baconian induction, you supposedly have no preconceived notions at all. You just gather facts, and you look for patterns in the facts. And I mention this because many leaders of the early fundamentalist movement were trained in the Baconian tradition. And they came up with a way of reading the Bible that's fundamentally Baconian. It's a book of facts, facts. None of this fancy schmancy interpretation stuff. There's no metaphor, there's no poetry. Everything means exactly what it says. And if you can just find the relationships among all of these absolutely true facts, you'll work out everything. You'll understand the history of the entire universe and God's plan for it. And that's an attitude that's lasted throughout the creationist movements, and you'll find it today. Whenever somebody says evolution is only a theory, you are hearing the ghost of Baconian induction, because Charles Darwin was actually kind of pivotal in transitioning from Baconian style science to the hypothetico-deductive method, where you pose a hypothesis and then you look for things that will test it. To a Baconian, that's not the way to do it. To a Baconian, that is back-asswards. And you hear an echo of that debate over how to do science whenever somebody tells you it's only a theory, using theory as a synonym for total rando guess that somebody pulled out of his butt. And this was all laid out in 1909 when a California oil billionaire funded the printing of a set of books called The Fundamentals and sent them to every church and every college library in the United States, including UCA's library, by the way. We've got a set of these in the library somewhere. And that really marks the beginning of modern style Christian fundamentalism. And so a Bible scholar who's committed to being Baconian will make diagrams like this. What this guy has done is assembled all sorts of facts from the Bible So let's see. Having a hard time reading this, but you can see there's a Bible verse, there's a Bible verse, there's a Bible verse, there's a Bible verse. He's interpreting a prophetic vision that the prophet Daniel had that took place over 70 weeks. But that 70 weeks is actually 1 year per week, which means that when Daniel saw it, there were 7 weeks to the Temple of Jerusalem and 62 weeks to the coming of the Messiah right there. And then there's a gap that wasn't revealed to Daniel, but we're now in the middle of the 70th week. And that last half of the week is 3 times a half, 42 months, or 1,260 days. You certainly don't need to know all of that. Oh, notice, by the way, he's also representing time by a statue of Nebuchadnezzar with a gold head, a silver chest, brass legs, and feet of clay. And again, you certainly don't need to know all those details unless you really want to, but just know that what Clarence Larkin over here has done is taken a bunch of scripture verses and arranged them in such a way, each one interpreted as fact, but arranged in such a way that they reveal the laws of creation, the great plan that God has that he revealed to Daniel. Very Baconian. This is very Baconian. You may not remember Harold Camping, but 3 times he's predicted the imminent end of the world. The most recent, I think, was May 21st, 2011. As he says up here, the Bible guarantees it. You may have noticed that he was actually wrong. The world did not, in fact, end on May 21st, 2011. But he did that by taking various verses and adding up numbers that you find in them and working out a timeline and concluding that this was when it ended. And it ultimately comes out of a Baconian approach to the Bible. There's no symbolism, there's no metaphor, there's certainly nothing that could ever possibly be wrong. All there are, like the old TV show Dragnet, just the facts, ma'am. The facts can be understood if you can just arrange them in the right way and come up with the general laws that determine those facts. So the kind of thing that you got in those Left Behind books and movies and even a video game, if memory serves, is ultimately very Baconian. This is a very distinctive style of reasoning in fundamentalist circles. As for what's wrong with it, I can leave the last word on the subject to Darwin. In a personal letter he wrote to a man named William Fawcett in 1861, as he says, about 30 years ago, there was much talk that geologists ought only to observe and not theorize. And I well remember someone saying that at this rate, a man might as well go into a gravel pit and count the pebbles and describe their colors. How odd it is that everyone should not see that all observation must be for or against some view if it is to be of any service. So the advantage of the hypothetico-deductive method is it gives you a guide for what facts you're supposed to gather, because there's a virtually infinite number of facts that you could go out and gather. The hypothesis that you've come up with is what enables you to select what you're going to observe, which certainly makes things a lot easier because there's such a huge number of things that you could observe. You know, you could end up gathering huge numbers of facts and they all turn out to be completely irrelevant, as irrelevant as the colors of all the pebbles in a gravel pit. So that's why we don't use Baconian induction now. At least not really standard. Even then, even though at about the beginning of the 20th century, this is when you start getting what we really can call fundamentalist Christianity. Even then, Not all of them insisted on a literal interpretation of the Bible. There were a great diversity of ways, even among the conservative fundamentalists, that they could reconcile science with the account of the creation of the world in the book of Genesis. One is theistic evolution. Theism is the position that a God does exist and he's active, or she, or whatever, and that God is active in the world, as opposed to deism with the letter D, in which there is a creator who made the universe, but the creator does not get involved with it anymore. In theistic evolution, evolution happens just as them scientists say, but ultimately God's in charge of the whole thing. You might remember that one of Darwin's friends, the American botanist Asa Gray, was both a committed evolutionist and also quite devout, and wrote from this perspective. There was also day-age creation, in which each of the 7 days of creation in the first chapter of Genesis is actually a really long period of time. Each day is maybe 1 billion years or something like that. And then gap theory states that the book of Genesis reads, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And there's an enormous amount of change, and we get primordial slime, and then we get trilobites, and then a giant meteorite hits the earth, and then we get dinosaurs, and then another meteorite hits the earth and makes the dinosaurs all go kersplooey. And then we get a whole bunch of weird mammals, and the continents start dancing around, and then there's various other catastrophes. And the earth was formless and void, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. That basically all of evolutionary history happened between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. So there were lots of ways of looking at all this. And I actually came across this in the UCA library, the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia from 1915, argued that there wasn't really any conflict between evolution and Christianity, that those views of the world were not mutually exclusive and contradictory. They must be conceived as supplementing one another and fulfilling each the promise and possibility of the other, which sounds very nice. However, things got political around about 1915. And up until about 1915, fundamentalism did not get involved in politics. Again, if you had this view that the world is going to get a lot worse and any change for the better is going to have to be done by Jesus, not by people, because people are evil and sinful and deluded. If that's your point of view, you tend to stay out of politics. Fundamentalists at the time focused on personal salvation, preaching the word, reaching as many people as they could, but not necessarily trying to change politics and society, because those were beyond saving. Those weren't going to last anyway. Doing that was building your house on sand. But things get really weird whenever America goes to war. And we entered the First World War in 1917. And that started freaking people out. That touched off fears of communism. You might recall that the Russian Revolution also hits in 1917. And after a period of civil war, Russia becomes ruled by a communist government that's actively trying to spread communism all over. 1917, people freaked out about the Germans. Some states actually made it illegal to speak or publish in German. And restaurants renamed sauerkraut Liberty Cabbage. I'm not kidding. Paranoia about immigrants reached a new high, although that had always been going on. There was real mistrust that somebody might try to impose a one world government after the war, and we'd all be ruled by, some faceless bureaucrats in some European city or something like that, and there'd be no freedom. And so, in the aftermath of World War One, this is when fundamentalists start flexing their political muscle. Their big success was prohibition, the constitutional amendment banning the sale of intoxicating liquors, which we had from 1919 to, I believe, 1934, if memory serves. You may have noticed it didn't work. But they also backed movements that would make it mandatory to rest on the Sabbath, which for almost everyone is Sunday, although for the Jews it's Saturday. Christians changed it. They pushed for laws that would have made it illegal to swear. And they also started pushing for laws that would ban the teaching of evolution, because this is now seen as a threat. So here's a couple of newspaper cartoons from the time. Over on the left, there's a Bolshevik, that's a Russian communist revolutionary, pounding the table and shouting, "There is no God but the proletariat." That's the oppressed working class. And his exact mirror is, some pointy-haired professor labeled "Science Falsely So-Called," pounding the table and insisting there is no God but protoplasm. Notice the scientist is waving a test tube, and the cartoonist has written up there at the top, "Not the Bible, but the test tube." This is where science is getting big enough and important enough and, looming large enough in American society that it starts to be seen as a threat. These two are both labeled the deicides, the God killers. There's another one. You can see there's a giant who's trying to pull down Christian civilization, which is being held up by the church over here. That says church, and the schools over here. And this giant's name is Modernism. And he's trying to pull down the pillars of church and school and bring down Christian civilization. And the legs that are supporting him, this says denial of Bible. And that says Darwinism. If this paranoia is starting to sound familiar, well, yes, there's a reason for that. This is its root. This is where this comes from. The freak out about how the evil, godless, Democrat, socialist, secular, humanist, communists are trying to get into your churches and schools and, brainwash your little kids with critical race theory and whatever else it is that they're freaking out about, and ultimately destroy America. The rhetoric that's been coming out from the right wing since the 90s isn't new. It's a revival of the rhetoric that was coming out of the right wing in the 20s. And it was in the 20s that several southern states banned the teaching of evolution in public educational institutions. One of them was Tennessee, that enacted a law prohibiting the teaching of evolution in 1925. The ACLU found a gym teacher by the name of John Scopes, who agreed to break the law so that his case could be heard in court. And hopefully the court case would get the law overturned. This led to a famous trial. It was the trial of the century. It was one that everybody followed, sometimes called the Scopes Monkey Trial, in the small town of Dayton, Tennessee. Scopes was convicted, but the conviction was overturned on a technicality. A very good movie, although not always historically accurate, by the way, called Inherit the Wind. Well worth watching. Spencer Tracy's in it, some really great, classic actors. That's a fictionalized account of the Scopes trial. And again, the names have all been changed and some liberties were taken with the events. Still a really good movie. So the law said, be it enacted that it shall be unlawful for any teacher in any of the universities, normals, and other public schools of the state. By the way, a normal is a school for training teachers. Um, UCA used to be called Arkansas State Normal School in the 20s, and then they changed it to Arkansas State Teachers College, and then State College of Arkansas, and then UCA. Anyway, it shall be unlawful for any teacher which are supported in whole or part by the public school funds of the state to teach any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. Well, Scopes deliberately broke that law, and he got his trial, and it was a national sensation when two of the most famous lawyers in the US squared off. On the left, Clarence Darrow, defending Scopes. On the right, William Jennings Bryant, making the state's case and prosecuting Scopes. As I mentioned, Scopes was eventually convicted. Darrow had brought in some leading scientists of the time to testify that, the scientific basis for the law was wrong. The judge wouldn't let them testify on the grounds was the question was not whether evolution was right or wrong, it was whether John Scopes had broken the law. But the high point was when Clarence Darrow actually got Bryant on the stand. You don't usually see one of the lawyers cross-examining another. And it made a sensation. The journalist H.L. Mencken was there. His substitute is played by Fred Astaire. No, or is it Gene Kelly? Yeah, it's played by Gene Kelly in the movie Inherit the Wind. One of the few roles where he doesn't dance a lot. And as Mencken, Mencken portrayed this as a complete loss for fundamentalism and a total embarrassment. As Mencken wrote, heave an egg out a Pullman window, that's a sleeping car on a train, and you will hit a fundamentalist almost anywhere in the United States today. Fundamentalists are thick in the mean streets behind the gasworks. They are everywhere where learning is too heavy a burden for mortal minds to carry, even the vague, pathetic learning on tap in the little red schoolhouses. And it also generated some good cartoons. So here you've got the monkeys taking a vote on whether humanity was related to them or not. And you can see that many of them are not in favor of claiming any relationship with us. Over there in the background, you have a bunch of humans. It looks like they're crashing their cars and getting into a terrible fight, and the monkeys are not interested in claiming any kinship. So some good cartoons came out of this. What grabbed everybody's attention was when Darrow cross-examined Bryant about Bryant's own views. Bryant was very well known as a very pious man who'd claimed that the teaching of evolution would, was this godless evil that would destroy American society and all that. But Bryant's actual views came out. So Darrow asked, do you think the earth was made in 6 days? Bryant says, not 6 days of 24 hours. Doesn't it say so? No, sir. You don't think that? And Bryant says, no, but I think it would just be just as easy for the kind of God we believe in to make the earth in 6 days as in 6 years or in 6 million years or in 600 million years. I do not think it important whether we believe one or the other. That's kind of big. At the time, even though you have people freaking out, this was a little booth that got set up outside the courthouse during the Scopes trial, selling books by the Anti-Evolution League, who I note wrote a book called Hell and the High School, which must have been about my PE classes in 1984. Anyway, at this time, even Brian, who is prosecuting Scopes for having taught evolution and broken state law doesn't consider it all that important as to what you believe about how creation happened. Your adherence to a particular model of creation was not considered a litmus test for whether you were a decent Christian or not. So, how did that change? It changed with Ellen White. Here she is. She came out of, okay, this guy named William Miller up in upstate New York had prophesied, doing these calculations based on dates found in the Bible, that the world was going to come to an end in 1843. When it didn't, he found an error and confidently advised that it would come to an end in 1844. When it didn't come to an end in 1844, it was called the Great Disappointment. Some of his followers had sold everything they had. Some of his followers would put on white robes and climb trees so that when Jesus came, they'd be that much closer to heaven. I guess they'd get to the front of the queue. And when the sun set on October 21st, 1844, there were a lot of terribly disappointed people. A number of people compared this to the disappointment felt in QAnon circles when Joe Biden got inaugurated entirely on schedule and in a very ordinary way. And, the great uprising ended up just not happening. When people get disappointed like that, some of them will try to rationalize it. And Ellen White and her husband, James White, came to believe that the world had started ending in 1844, that God had begun cleansing the temple of heaven. He hadn't come on earth yet, but 1844 was still when the really final clock started ticking. She started having visions where, according to her, God would take her around and show her the wonders of creation and reveal things to her, and she would write all of this down. And by 1867, a new denomination is founded, the Seventh-day Adventists. Her books, her prophecies are still read by modern Adventists. And White refused anything but an absolutely literal interpretation of Genesis. If it says God took 6 days to make the world, then it was 6 days, and each day was a period of 24 hours. None of your fancy, each day is a million years type stuff. If it says day, it means day. If you add up all of the ages of everybody in the Bible and you get an age of the earth of 6,000 years, then it's 6,000 years. No room for interpretation there. She'd actually had God taking her on guided tours of the solar system through space and time. God showed her visions of Jupiter and Saturn and showed her the wrong number of moons. And as she said, I was carried back to the creation and was shown that the first week in which God performed the work of creation in 6 days and was arrested on the seventh day was just like every other week. The infidel supposition that the events of the first week required 7 vast indefinite periods for their accomplishment strikes directly at the foundation of the Sabbath of the fourth commandment. The fourth commandment, for those of you that don't remember, says, remember the Sabbath day. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, but on the seventh day you shall rest. Because this mirrors the 6 days in which God made the universe and rested on the seventh. And any other interpretation is, as she put it, the worst kind of infidelity. For with many who profess to believe the record of creation, it is infidelity in disguise. One little bit of compromise and you've just rejected the fourth commandment, and you might as well just reject all the other 9 of them because you're going to hell. So there. An Adventist school teacher named George McCready Price, who was actually from Canada, Nova Scotia, I want to say, somewhere in Atlantic Canada, was raised as an Adventist, believed everything that Ellen White said, and never managed to get much scientific training. What he did get very good at was producing this huge flood of books and pamphlets, picking apart what scientists had said, carefully selecting quotes, and using them to demonstrate that evolution was a complete and utter lie, fraud, and phony, and was a tottering house of cards that was about to collapse at any moment. There is really no excuse in this day of intelligence for any person longer to hold an evolutionary theory of the rocks. The only alternative now, in the light of modern science, is to believe in the real, literal creation as taught in the Bible. Here's the thing: the Adventists are kind of their own denomination. Um, I really don't want to, I have no position on this, and I don't want to stir up controversy, but a number of Christian denominations don't consider the Adventists to be fully Christian. There's some question about that. But in the 50s, a professor of engineering at Rice named Henry Morris got together with a Missouri Synod Lutheran theologian named John Whitcomb, and they co-authored a book that came out in 1960 called The Genesis Flood. And the Genesis Flood is basically George McCready Price with the serial numbers filed off. They've gotten rid of the Adventism. They've gotten rid of anything that's specific to the Seventh-day Adventist religion, and they bring it into the mainstream of Christian fundamentalism. And they touch off the modern young earth creationism movement, pushed by groups like the Institute for Creation Research, based in that buckle on the Bible Belt known as San Diego, California, and the Creation Research Society, whose journal I used to go over to CBC and read because they'd have it in the library, and so on. This is ultimately where young earth creationism comes from. What's young earth creationism? I won't read all of this, but their official statement of faith, adopted when they were founded in 1963, says, first, the Bible is the written word of God. All its assertions are historically and scientifically true in the original autographs. I mean, we don't have original autographs, but okay. This means that the account of origins in Genesis is a factual presentation of simple historical truths. No poetry, no metaphor, no room for interpretation, none of this messing around with whether it was written by the priestly author or the Yahwist author. It's all as factually true as, a news broadcast. All basic types of living things, including man, were made by direct creative acts of God during creation week. Whatever biological changes have occurred since creation week have only been accomplished within the original created kinds. There we go to that typological thinking. Every form of life fits into one of its nice little pigeonholes. There's no in-betweens. There's nothing in between different kinds. Everything goes right where it's supposed to be. The Great Flood described in Genesis was a historic event. If the Bible says the entire earth was covered by water, then by God, the entire earth was covered by water. And then 4, we are an organization of Christians who accept Jesus as our Lord and Savior. The account of the special creation of Adam and Eve and their fall into sin is the basis for our belief in the necessity of a Savior for all mankind. If you don't believe in Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and then Eve does what the serpent tells her to do and eats an apple and gives it to Adam, if you don't believe in that, then you don't believe in original sin. If you don't believe in original sin, there's no need for anybody to save you from it. So there's no point in Jesus. And if you don't believe in Adam and Eve 6,000 years ago after a 7-day creation week, you might as well just, go be a Buddhist or something. Salvation can only come through accepting Jesus Christ as our Savior. And there's no room for compromise. I got this from the Institute for Creation Research's newsletter a few years ago. The road of compromise looks attractive at first, but long experience has proved it to be a one-way street. The evolutionists at the end of the road are never satisfied until their opponents travel all the way to the atheistic void at its end, ending in a precipice and then the awful void of rational religion or atheism. Our advice is to stay on the straight and narrow road of the pure Word of God. Right. I should mention, by the way, that the majority of Christian denominations don't really have a beef with evolution and are quite willing to accept that you can interpret the events of Genesis symbolically in such a way that they're important. And if you're a believer, they're real, but they're not literal. There can be more than one type of truth that we're talking about. I myself take no position on this. It's not my circus and not my clowns. But, my mother has been very devout all of her life, or at least all that I've known. Certainly took me to church a lot. Didn't really take, but, now there's only me to blame, but Mama tried. And she has no problem with evolution. She's always told me she thought it was grander to think of a universe developing over 4.6 billion years and culminating in intelligent life, that was a greater display of God's power than God saying zap and bang, it happens 6,000 years ago. You can, take that however you want to. It's none of my business. But the Roman Catholic Church, most Orthodox churches, as far as I know, and mainstream Protestants have no real problem with evolution. You get this in fundamentalist Christianity and not always even there. I've met some Baptists who are really quite surprisingly open-minded. You also get it in fundamentalist Islamic creationism, which is basically Christian creationism with the serial numbers filed off, mostly pushed by some rich, weird guy in Turkey named Harun Yahya. Oh, and you also get it in the Hare Krishnas. Anyway, young Earth creationist thought looks like this. They're very essentialist in their taxonomy, very, typological in their thinking. The basic unit of biodiversity is called the baramin. That's bad Hebrew for created kind. I've asked for clarification as to how you'd recognize a baramin, and I have yet to get a straight answer, but that's what they are. This very Baconian outlook where you reject evolution because it's only a theory and you're supposed to focus on facts, not theories. They'll build very complicated models of how creation must have happened and how it could be that the earth could suddenly get covered in enough water to cover the entire globe for a year and then have the water mostly go away. That's kind of a difficult problem, and they'll come up with all sorts of complex explanations for how it could have happened, how it must have happened. At the same time, they have to acknowledge that God can do anything he wants and doesn't have to follow the laws of physics at all. So kind of contradictory there. And a big one is they respect science very much, but they're paranoid towards the scientific elite, all those professors in their fancy universities getting paid by your tax dollars, who it is assumed are concealing the truth. Sorry, that should be the truth, for some evil and nefarious purpose that probably has to do with Satan. the scientific modeling can get pretty complicated. This was a magazine that I got when I visited the Creation Evidences Museum in Glen Rose, Texas, which at the time was in this pink double wide. But since then, I think they got the money to build a better museum. There actually used to be a creationist museum in Eureka Springs, but I think they moved it. I don't believe it's there now, which is a shame. It would have made a nice field trip. So you have, before the flood, the earth is surrounded by a firmament, which is composed of the elements of water. That's where some of the water for the biblical flood comes. It comes from this canopy over the earth called the firmamental canopy. The tectonic plates of the earth are floating on a layer of water called the Great Waters, and that's where some more of the flood comes from, these waters coming up from what the Bible calls the fountains of the deep. Below that, you have the granite foundations of the earth, which are, whatever this means, not in their molten context, but in perfect balance. And then the earth's core is radioactive, and it's been aligned and distributed with design to heat earth gently. And so this is all spelled out in mind-numbing detail as to what God must have been doing when he created the earth and then caused the flood and all of that. And this type of reasoning really should sound familiar. And this is kind of the main reason why I've even taken class time to talk about this. It's because from where I've been sitting, young earth creationist style of reasoning has had legs far beyond the simple scientific issues in play. You can find much the same style of thinking among the people that deny that the Holocaust happened, or the people that deny that the earth is round, or the people that are opposed to vaccination, or the 9/11 truthers, or so much of the other things that's swirling around in the media sphere today, especially that paranoia, the idea that science is a great thing, but there's a conspiracy of scientists who are trying to cover up the truth. And all these PhDs in their ivory tower are either deluded or evil because they're hiding the truth. And the only true science is being done by somebody who makes YouTube videos in dad's basement. There's that very much the sort of respect for scientists while hating and fearing most of the people that actually do science. We've seen this with the protest over masking and getting the COVID vaccine and the anti-vax movement in general. It pops up in political issues all the time. And from where I've been sitting, young earth creationism was kind of a testing ground for things like that. That's where a lot of this style of thinking got developed and perfected between about 1960 and sort of its high watermark in the 80s. And then I think a lot of that style of thinking got passed on to other conspiracies, and we continue to deal with it now. Again, most Christianity doesn't really have an issue with this sort of thing. And back in the 80s, both the Roman Catholic Church and several Protestant denominations condemned scientific creationism as promoting a particular religious dogma and rejecting the limited insight and rigid dogmatism of the creationist movement. So it is certainly quite possible to be a perfectly devout and practicing Christian, or just about any religion, and not get into, not adopt this particular view of the Bible, science, and history. But there are some people that do. And I think you probably can tell where my allegiance lies, but I have not lectured in this way to try to condemn anybody. I'm just trying to point out where this stuff is coming from, what its roots are, why people who are writing from a young earth creationist perspective say the things that they do. Young earth creationism has kind of morphed in recent years. Intelligent design kind of got away from arguing about the granite foundations of the earth in perfect non-molten balance or whatever it is, and just went looking for evidence of divine design without worrying too much about who the designer was. But you can still find a lot of common points there between ID and this kind of young earth creationism coming out of Whitcomb and Morris's book. And I just wanted to show as best I can where it's ultimately coming from. And what you choose to make of it is up to you, because that was the last lecture of the semester. And we can stick a fork in this one because it's done, except for the final and the grades.